Political and economic change. Political and economic change in Nigeria may be analyzed by dividing its history into three parts: pre-colonial, colonial, and modern eras. Nigeria's political influences in pre-colonial days varied widely according to ethnicity and region, as did its economic practices. British control during the colonial era brought contradictory political influences: democracy versus subjugation to colonial rule. Economically, Nigeria has become highly dependent on British demands, and the colony established a mercantilist role in providing raw materials like oil to industrialized nations. Independence in 1960 meant that one of Nigeria's biggest challenges was just that: how does a new country truly become independent when it's been dependent for so long? The sources of change have varied with each era, but they have all had important consequences for the modern Nigerian state. The pre-colonial era, 800 to 1860 CE. From the beginning, Nigerian geography has dictated political and social and economic development. The savanna eras of the north invited easy trade through Saharan Berbers traders up in the northern Africa, whereas the people of the forested areas of the south were not in contact with the Berbers. Change occurred through cultural diffusion, or contact with and spread of customs and beliefs of other people. Most important was the diffusion of Islam, a change that was gradual, with conversion to the religion occurring slowly but steadily over time. Despite the overall nature of gradual change, an important group, the Fulani, came to the north through jihad, or Islamic holy war, so this change occurred abruptly. In 1808, the Fulani established the Sokoto Caliphate, a Muslim state that encompassed the entire northwest-north midsection and part of the northeast. The Caliphate traded with Europeans and eventually succumbed to British colonial rule by 1900. However, it put in place a tradition of an organized central government based on religious faith. In contrast, people in the South generally lived communally and in closer contact with the Atlantic Ocean. Trade. As a result, even before the colonial era, they came into contact with Europeans who converted many of them to Christianity. An important consequence of this contact plagued Nigeria from the 16th to the 19th centuries in the form of the Atlantic slave trade. The first contacts were with the Portuguese, but the real displacement of people began in the 17th century, when the Dutch, British, French, and Spanish traders began transporting Africans in large numbers to the New World from the Nigerian coast. The impact on the people is difficult to quantify, but the very nature of the slave trade meant that countless young males were forced to leave their native lands. The colonial era, 1860 to 1960. European influence began in an earlier era, but in 1860 the British imposed indirect rule, in which they trained natives primarily from the south to fill the European-style bureaucracy. The British established the area that would become Nigeria in 1860 as a trading outlet, where they made use of natural resources and cheap human labor. The British influence was strongest in the south, emanating from the ports along the coast. Because the North was already organized into political hierarchies according to Islamic tradition, the British left the area's government structures primarily intact. These political changes gave more power to elites and reinforced their tendencies to seek personal benefit from their positions. It further emphasized differences between the North and South, leaving the colony vulnerable to divisions that later caused serious conflict and violence. Another important influence from the colonial era was the introduction to Nigeria of Western-style education. Christian missionaries set up schools subsidized by the British government, primarily for elementary education. In 1934, the first higher education institution was opened, and the first university was founded in 1948. This change had many important consequences, the most obvious being the creation of a relatively literate population. However, it also reinforced some growing cleavages. Elites became more and more separated from the people because they received most of the benefits of education. As a result, they tended to see themselves as privileged leaders who deserved economic rewards. Another consequence was a deepening of the rift between North and South, since most of the British schools were located in the South and very few Northerners had access to Western-style education. In turn, Northerners came to be seen as backward by Southerners, and Northerners came to resent this stereotype. Modern Nigeria, 1960 to the present. Nigeria's transition to independence began to take place in the years preceding 1960, with the British trying to prepare Nigerians to rule their own country. Indeed, the preparation began early because the British trained natives to join the bureaucracy. Education invariably included the teaching of Western political values, including freedom, justice, and equality of opportunity. These lessons were not lost on the native leaders for Nigerian independence, so British education sowed the seeds for decolonization. An important change in the early post-colonial days came in 1966, when the parliamentary government was replaced by a military dictatorship. This action set in motion the tendency for governments to change hands quickly and violently, as the nation began to experience a series of military coups d'etats. In 1979, the military dictator, Olusegun Obasanjo, willingly stood down for a democratically elected president, Shehu Shagari. But Shagari was forced out of office in 1983 by a military coup led by General Muhammadu Buhari. 2 more coups kept Nigeria under military dictatorship until 1999, when a democratic election brought Obasanjo back to power, but this time as a civilian. The elections of 1999, 2003, and 2007 were rife with fraud and violence, with the election of 2007 probably the worst of all. At the same time, the development of nationalism eluded Nigeria and created the national question, or the possibility that Nigeria would not survive as a country. The modern era has also seen ethnic identities become the major basis for conflicts in Nigeria. Before the colonial era, these ethnicities certainly existed, but the different identities did not lead to constant conflict. Independence brought on a competition among groups based on heightened awareness of ethnic differences encouraged by the British. Once the British were gone, competition among military generals for control of the country became based on ethnicity, and the heightened tension have left reconciliation of differences all the more difficult. Another change brought about during the modern era has been the institutionalization of corruption among the political elite. This tendency was made much worse by 2 military presidents, General Ibrahim B. Babangida, president from 1985 to 1993, and General Sani Abacha from 1993 to 1998. Both generals maintained large foreign bank accounts, with regular deposits being diverted from the Nigerian state. Other funds went to the Nigerian elite through the patron-client system. For example, it is estimated that about 2/3 of the windfall Nigeria received in oil sales during the First Persian Gulf War in 1991 ended up in the hands of Nigerian elites. Each military leader between 1966 and 1999 promised to transfer power to civilians as soon as the country was stable. In 1993, it seemed as if the time had arrived when civilian Mashoud Abiola won the presidential elections. However, General Babangida annulled the election only to lose power to General Sani Abacha in a military coup later that year. When Abacha died suddenly in 1998, a Middle Belt Muslim general, Abdusalami Abubakar, succeeded him, with a now familiar promise to eventually hand the government to a duly elected civilian. He set up a transition team, elections were held in 1999, and the winner, Olusegun Obasanjo, became president. Obasanjo was re-elected in 2003, and some hope that these events indicate the long-anticipated arrival of a democratic government. However, 2 facts made it difficult to claim the triumph of democracy. Obasanjo was a former military general, and both elections were characterized by voting fraud. The election of 2007 was even more questionable than the previous 2, and so the potential for instability is still a threat to the country. Even though the elections of 2011 and 2015 were an improvement, no clear trend toward democratization is yet in place.